Live from Quito, Ecuador, I'm Soini Gray and this is From the South, the daily news brief from Telesur English, and we start this new edition right now. Thank you for joining us. 2 weeks after he was released from prison and pardoned on medical grounds, Peru's former leader, Alberto Fujimori, has been found well enough to go home. Fujimori waved to the crowds as he was wheeled to freedom from the hospital in Lima. There were cries of welcome and distress as Fujimori set off for the family home alongside his son Kenji. It has been alleged that Kenji helped to block an impeachment vote against the current president, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, in exchange for his father's pardon. And human rights organizations in Peru are working on several legal angles to revoke the pardon granted to Alberto Fujimori.
Since President Pedro Pablo Kuczynski freed Alberto Fujimori, family members of those killed in Barrios Altos and La Cantuta University during Fujimori's regime have been working on several legal actions to revoke this humanitarian pardon and make the former president serve his 25-year sentence.
This is the only way we can make things happen. All the different governments have never listened to us. What we want is justice and to be heard.
They have reached out to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, where an audience will take place on February 2nd. An opportunity for the victim's defense to present its case against Fujimori's pardon.
The pardon was based on a political move, and not on a humanitarian decision. Also, this broke several international processes that are regulated by Peru's law. Former President Fujimori doesn't have any serious health problems to be granted a humanitarian pardon.
Human rights organizations filed a complaint against this pardon in order for Fujimori to face trial for other crimes, like the killing of 6 campesinos in Pativilca village.
Is it possible that the government could stop a legal process that denies victims the truth and ensure that all those responsible are judged and punished after due process? We don't think so. That is why we are asking the criminal court to control this legal process.
Meanwhile, several social organizations called for a new demonstration to reject the pardon to Fujimori on January 11.
On Wednesday, Peru's Minister of Defense became the 3rd member of President Kuczynski's government to resign over the pardon. Our correspondent in Lima, Jaime Herrera, has more.
Muchas gracias por el pase, compañeros. En efecto, la crisis política que vive el gobierno sigue llevando a la división.
Yet another high-profile official has resigned from the government of Pedro Pablo Kuczynski after the political crisis that has been hitting the country for the last few weeks. This time, it is the Minister of Defense, Jorge Nieto Montesinos, that joined Salvador del Solar, Ministry of Culture, and Carlos Basombrio, Ministry of the Interior, to reject the pardon of President Kuczynski granted to Alberto Fujimori. Other public servants have also resigned, especially those working for human rights government programs. This is the case of Roger Rodriguez, former official at the Ministry of Justice, who criticized the government's decision and said that Fujimori didn't comply with all that was needed to ask for a pardon, and that the former president has no serious health conditions putting his life in danger. Until today, 14 officials have resigned from the Pedro Pablo Kuczynski's government, who has been in office for just 1 year and a half. People are announcing more demonstrations in the coming days to reject the pardon.
Jaime Herrera with that report. The Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, is expected to make a number of economic announcements at his first cabinet meeting for the new year. The government has already introduced an increase in the minimum wage and an extra end-of-year bonus. It is promising to defend living standards despite international financial sanctions and attacks on its plans to restructure its debt. Our Freddie Gillingham has more from Caracas.
Earlier this week, the New York-based credit rating agency Standard & Poor declared that Venezuela had missed a debt repayment of $35 million, paving the way for more condemnation against the Latin American nation in the international media. However, As part of the economic war against Venezuela, US-imposed sanctions are preventing the country from doing trading and investing with American banks. This opens up questions on what the agenda is for companies like Standard & Poor, and particularly how the media responds to their announcements. Placing Venezuela in the category of default can have major repercussions, as Carlos Lasso, a financial expert we spoke to, explains.
The rates of agencies like Standard & Poor and others towards Venezuela, like D of default, means that Venezuela comes into risk. A country that comes into risk means that they will not be able to pay the interest of any other debt restructuring in the future. The interest could be more than 18, 20, or even 25%, which are an exaggeration internationally. So Venezuela is then in a position where they will not be able to pay it because at the same time there's a reduction of oil prices. So this is a way to asphyxiate the Venezuelan economy.
The default announcement on Monday comes just after Venezuelan government officials met with bondholders in Caracas. However, progress like this has little weight if a media campaign declaring default only discourages private investors.
These measures discredited the state or the companies, making the bonds lose their value. In buying them for very low prices, they then wait until they can sell it at 100% of its value. This is what we saw in Argentina, and this is why we call it vulture capitals. This is what Standard & Poor's expects.
Despite the challenges, Venezuela is initiating new ways of dealing with this worsening economic war. A newly launched cryptocurrency backed by the country's vast mineral wealth is just one alternative that the government is having to come up with. Freddie Gillingham, Telesur, Caracas.
Wrapping up a two-day visit to Cuba, the EU's top diplomat, Federica Mogherini, announced a series of agreements and said a delegation from the European Investment Bank would visit Cuba later this month. She announced a $60 million cooperation agreement in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, culture, and expertise, and repeatedly criticized the U.S. economic blockade of Cuba.
We will soon sign a new program for cooperation for the utilization of renewable energy with a value of 18 million euros, and one for another program for sustainable agriculture worth 21 million euros. We are going to increase and widen the program for exchange of culture and experts with a value of 10 million euros.
We regret that the current US administration has apparently changed policy towards Cuba. We are convinced, as we were 1 year ago and as we were 2 years ago, that it is in our European interest, it is in Cuban interest, and it is in the international interest at large to have relations, to discuss issues of disagreement, and to deepen and extend cooperation.
Puerto Rico's Governor Ricardo Rosselló says that at least 150,000 Puerto Ricans left after Hurricane Maria hit the island more than 3 months ago. The announcement came after Rosselló met with Senators Richard Blumenthal and Chris Murphy to discuss recovery efforts on the island and what to do next to bring the country back to normalcy. During the press conference, the governor said that the number of people who actually left the island ranges between 150,000 and 250,000. And we'll be back very soon, so stay with us. We return now to Peru, where it's not just the pardon given to Alberto Fujimori that promises a turbulent new year. Environmental and social organizations have warned that 2018 could be a year filled with social unrest due to an increase in investments in mining projects accompanied by policies of environmental suppression.
The Chinese company Rio Blanco is saying that it will retake the Majaz project in the north of Peru with the hopes of extracting 50 million tons of copper a year, even though in 2007 there was a public consultation on the issue where 97% of the community said no to the mining project because it will affect natural resources.
What is this all leading to? It's an increase in social conflict. Confrontations are taking place again. Again, there are complaints against leaders that run the demonstrations in Uncabamba, for example.
According to Kaczynski's government, the recovery of the Peruvian economy for 2018 depends on the reactivation of stalled mining projects. However, for environmental organizations, the reactivation comes with a policy that will weaken environmental institutions.
A recent regulation has just exempted some mining projects with medium to large environmental impact. So this is really worrying because the environmental impact studies continue to be the only and minimum guarantee that citizens have that these projects will not affect us environmentally and socially.
Policies that, according to environmental NGOs, could motivate social unrest, especially in the southern Andean corridor, as one of the greatest concerns in this area are the dozens of projects where the government has declared a state of emergency, blocking the fundamental right of the community to protest.
It is pathetic that the government doesn't have any other tools to solve these conflicts. It's an authoritarian way, a way imposed by the armed forces of a supposed attempt for peace.
According to environmentalists, after 5 years of mining investments drop, the concessions for the extraction activity will account for 14% of the national environment. And many of these concessions are in vulnerable areas or where other renewable economic activities are carried out.
Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos has met with the FARC in Cartagena to review the peace agreement, advancements and challenges. Former Spanish Prime Minister Felipe González and former President of Uruguay, José Mujica, participated as international mediators. FARC members have accused the Colombian government of not completing its end of the peace accords since signing just over 1 year ago. And our correspondent in Bogotá, Milton Henao, has this.
The meeting still between the FARC party and the Colombian government has concluded today in Cartagena. However, little is known about the decisions and results of the agreements. A statement of the Peace Process Observation Committee said that only 18% of the peace agreements signed in Havana has been fulfilled. Since the agreement was signed in November 2016, at least 105 human rights activists have died. Over 59% of them were killed executed. Also, small-scale farmers participating in Colombia's peace agreement continue to be gunned down or harassed in their rural communities. It is important to remember that a few weeks ago, the Colombian Congress failed to pass important peace legislation.
Panama has extradited back to Mexico a former state governor wanted for corruption. Roberto Borge was escorted by Panamanian police to a plane at the Tucumán airport in Panama City. The former governor of Quintana Roo State, for Mexicans ruling pre-party, is accused of selling government real estate at 1% of its value, as well as money laundering and other offenses. And despite the campaign promises of Panamanian President Juan Carlos Varela calling for a constituent process, a new constitution continues without being a reality. Panamanian social and political movements said that this is vital to end the inequality and corruption that is increasing in the Isthmus.
2018 is the penultimate year in office for the government of President Juan Carlos Varela. A new cycle begins, and the campaign promise of a constituent assembly still hasn't been kept.
The proposal presented by the president is not meant to be fulfilled. There are many hidden interests. An original constituent assembly is what people want, because this is a democratic mechanism meant to put an end to state corruption. So they don't want to make this a reality. They're looking to control our country with false promises that in the end do not resolve Panamanians' needs.
The executive power not only refuses to call for a constituent assembly, but also to promote any deep changes in all the country's public institutions.
Because it involves changing all the rules of the game. and it will imply a new economic and political model for the country. It is obvious that these cannot be accepted by the groups in power, who enrich themselves every day by using the old constitution.
A new constitution would also help to sweep away problems of inequality. Panama is one of the most unequal countries in the world, and more than 20% of the population lives in poverty.
It must start from the needs of the population. Recognize that the people rely on our sovereignty. That power is in the hands of the people. If we create a new constitution, it has to be in favor of the poor majority, and start from the fact that it needs to be a constitution that helps everyone.
The new constitution would be an instrument for the social movements to fight against increasing corruption and is seen as the best hope for reforming the foundations of the state.
The left-wing frontrunner in Mexico's presidential election, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has said that he opposes the military-first approach of the PRI and pledged to create a national guard. The 64-year-old former Mexico City mayor said that he would personally take a central role in restoring order after years of violence that has claimed tens of thousands of lives.
Vamos a integrar a todas las fuerzas.
We are going to integrate all forces, police and military of the country, in a single corporation. A national guard will be created to guarantee public security.
Our correspondent, Ecuador's Foreign Minister Guillaume Long, we've been having a bit of error. The campaign for Ecuador's national referendum on February 4th has begun. Social and political organizations are forming strategies to win over the electorate. More details in this report.
Political organizations have been authorized to hold a month-long campaign for either the yes or no options in the upcoming referendum. The Women's National Permanent Forum, an organization in defense of human rights, and one of only 4 registered in support of a no vote, explain why they have chosen to stand against the government's proposals.
This will be a campaign for and by the people, by women, by the youth, who are aware that this whole thing is an unnecessary whim. We do not need an unconstitutional and illegal referendum.
Similar organizations, along with assembly members of Alianza País, who support the views of Rafael Correa, the leader of the citizen revolution, will be campaigning for a no vote in the referendum. One of their main arguments is what they call President Lenin Moreno's betrayal of the party's principles.
We will vote no, rejecting President Lenin Moreno's betrayal. He got support by aligning himself with the victories of the past 10 years and using Rafael Correa's citizen revolution, only to turn into the worst of traitors.
Other organizations and political players who have long been against the citizen revolution have also started to travel to different cities supporting a yes vote in the referendum.
Today marks a real and concrete possibility for us to regain a multi-party system.
Ecuadorians will once again go to the polls to answer 7 questions, 5 of which involve constitutional reforms, while the remaining 2 are questions about oil drilling and land speculation.
Brazil's state-owned company, Petrobras, will pay almost $3 billion to settle a legal complaint filed by the investors in a New York court after the car wash corruption scandal broke out. Their defense said that the settlement does not recognize that the state company was involved in any irregular process. Brazilian authorities have returned more than $400 million to the company, recovered from those cooperating with the investigation. And protests against layoffs and labor reforms in Argentina continued on Thursday with a strike by state workers. The 24-hour stoppage was called by the ATE Public Workers Union. The protesters marched from the obelisk in Buenos Aires to the presidential palace to denounce the sacking of 1,200 civil servants in December. President Mauricio Macri has promised to reduce the size of the state sector to cover his budget deficit.
Our boss isn't the government in power. Our boss is the Argentine people, and we, at its service, want to build a democratic and popular state.
Our correspondent Edgardo Esteban was with the striking state workers in Buenos Aires and sent this report.
Argentine state workers from all over the country have stopped their activities for the next 24 hours to mobilize from downtown Buenos Aires to the Ministry of Planning as a form of protest against Mauricio Macri's decision to fire public workers and to close public institutions as one of his neoliberal measures. Around 1,200 workers were fired at the end of 2017 and at the beginning of 2018. This forecasts an intense year for social protests and workers' mobilizations. Not only state workers, but also labor unions and workers' associations from all over the country, starting from the current withdrawal of thousands of jobs by Mauricio Macri's government, which also affects the private sector.
Edgardo Esteban with that report. A poll by the Center for Studies of Public Opinion shows that 70% of Argentinians feel pessimistic about the economic situation. It was done as an exclusive for Página 12 newspaper. It warns that the government is starting 2018 with a worrying decrease in prospects. More from our correspondent in Buenos Aires, Carolina Silvestre.
Economist Ernesto Matos knows that the worsening state of President Macri's administration is due to adjustment policies that have been applied to most vulnerable sectors.
Workers, unions, small and medium industries are the ones who are losing. We have a commercial deficit of $7.6 billion, which stems mostly from imports, and 40% of this deficit comes from importing energy sources.
Matos warns that prospects are continuing to fall because people are noticing who this economy model benefits the most and who it doesn't.
The winners here are big transnational industries, who are profiting from closing down factories and by controlling the network of providers and commercialization. This allows them to set prices.
With rising prices for transport, electricity, gas, tolls, phones, lines and food, along with an increase in price for the dollar, the proposed budget for the year is already outdated. The Chief of Ministers admitted this a few days ago after announcing annual inflation will rise by 18%.
The current economic scenario will cause further protests, and for different reasons, every day. The level of social anger is difficult to contain, and we don't see why it must be contained, since this government was elected by a large part of the population, and the damage is affecting them in a big way.
Unhappiness deepens when, during a time of mass layoffs and rising concern, the Labour Minister of the ruling party announces that unions are to decrease by 15%.
We are betting on government allowing us to get work, but Macri is headstrong against this idea. He is his worst enemy. He continues to create unfavorable scenarios for workers, for retirees, for the population in general. So our last resort is resistance.
For Daniel Catalano, a union leader representing state workers, 2018 we see an increase of conflicts as the government neoliberal model deepens.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. South Korea President Moon Jae-in and U.S. President Donald Trump have agreed to not conduct joint military drills during the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang next month. In a telephone call, Trump said he hopes inter-Korean talks would lead to good results and that he would send a high-level delegation, including members of his own family, to the Winter Olympics. The Senior Secretary of Public Relations for President of South Korea said at a news conference.
The two leaders agreed not to conduct South Korea-US joint military drills during Pyeongchang's Olympics and to do their best to ensure the security of the Olympics.
And now let's look at some of the other news from around the world.
More than a dozen people have been killed and hundreds were feared injured after a train struck a lorry, derailed and burst into flames in South Africa as it travelled between Port Elizabeth and Johannesburg. 4 of the injured are quite critical.
For now, because we are still doing investigation, 12 fatalities have been confirmed. 12 people have died. But we don't know, after we'll have completed our investigation, as to how many fatalities will we have discovered. And there are almost 268 people that have been injured, and 4 of them are quite critical.
More than 100 protesters have marched through the streets of Paris to demand the release of Palestinian activist Ahed Tamimi and her family. Ahed was charged in an Israeli court for assaulting security forces, incitement and throwing stones after she hit a soldier outside her home in the West Bank. Ahed's mother, Nariman Tamimi, also has been charged with incitement and assault.
In the 21st century, this is the only instance of colonization. Macron himself said that colonization was a crime against humanity, so he should maybe act upon his words and stop rolling out the red carpet for a big war criminal.
At least 10 teachers have been arrested and 2 injured in Karachi, where a large number of teachers have been protesting since 11 days against the non-payment of salaries. Police fired tear gas and baton-charged teachers when they attempted to march towards a Pakistani politician's house. The explosive new book Fire and Fury, which has exposed chaos behind the scenes at the White House, was released middle of the night by its United States publisher in response to Donald Trump's lawyers who threatened to shut down the book. The book's due date was on 9th of January.
Catalan leader Oriol Junqueras has asked to be released from jail after more than 2 months in detention for his role in the independence movement. State prosecutors have asked the court to keep the separatist leader in jail, preventing him from swearing in at the opening session of the new Catalan parliament, where his party holds a slim majority with 52 seats. Next week, another separatist leader, Jordi Sanchez, will also appear in court.
They can't be deprived of their civil rights. If they were chosen, they have to be able to exercise their functions as parliamentarians. But doing it is hard when they are jailed 700 kilometers away.
10 workers have been killed in a fire at a shoe factory near the Siberian town of Iskitim in Russia. According to the initial reports, most of the people killed were Chinese, and 2 are from Kazakhstan. The victims tried to extinguish the fire before the arrival of firefighters, but they could not, and they died of smoke inhalation. The cause of the blaze may have been a short circuit. And we've come to the end of this morning's news brief. For these and many other stories, you can find them on our website, telesiotv.net/English. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesio English, I'm Sweeney Gray. Thank you so much for watching.